The Absurd Man. If Stavrogin believes, he does not think he believes. If he does not believe, he does not think he does not believe. Quote, The Possessed. My field, said Goethe, is time. That is indeed the absurd speech. What, in fact, is the absurd man? He who, without negating it, does nothing for the eternal. Not that nostalgia is foreign to him, but he prefers his courage and his reasoning. The first teaches him to live without appeal, and to get along with what he has. The second informs him of his limits. Assured of his temporarily limited freedom, of his revolt devoid of future, and of his mortal consciousness, he lives out his adventure within the span of his lifetime. That is his field, that is his action, which he shields from any judgment but his own. A greater life cannot mean for him another life. That would be unfair. I am not even speaking here of that paltry eternity that is called posterity. Madame Ronald relied on herself. That rashness was taught a lesson. Posterity is glad to quote her remark, but forgets to judge it. Madame Ronald is indifferent to posterity. There can be no question of holding forth on ethics. I have seen people behave badly with great morality, and I note every day that integrity has no need of rules. There is but one moral code that the absurd man can accept, the one that is not separated from God, the one that is dictated. But it so happens that he lives outside that God. As for others, I mean also immoralism, the absurd man sees nothing in them but justifications, and he has nothing to justify. I start out here from the principle of his innocence. That innocence is to be feared. Everything is permitted, exclaims Ivan Karamazov. That too smacks of the absurd, but on condition that it be not taken in the vulgar sense. I don't know whether or not it has been sufficiently pointed out that it is not an outburst of relief or of joy, but rather a bitter acknowledgement of a fact. The certainty of a God giving a meaning to life far surpasses in attractiveness the ability to behave badly with impunity. The choice would not be hard to make, but there is no choice, and that is where the bitterness comes from. The absurd does not liberate, it binds. It does not authorize all actions. Everything is permitted does not mean that nothing is forbidden. The absurd merely confers an equivalence on the consequences of these actions. It does not recommend a crime, for this would be childish, but it restores to the remorse its futility. Likewise, if all experiences are indifferent, that of duty is as legitimate as any other. One can be virtuous through a whim. All systems of morality are based on the idea that an action has consequences that legitimize or cancel it. A mind imbued with the absurd merely judges that those consequences must be considered calmly. It is ready to pay up. In other words, there may be responsible persons, but there are no guilty ones, in its opinion. At very most, such a mind will consent to use past experience as a basis for its future actions. Time will prolong time, and life will serve life. In this field that is both limited and bulging with possibilities, everything in himself except his lucidity seems unforeseeable to him. What rule, then, could emanate from that unreasonable order? The only truth that might seem instructive to him is not formal. It comes to life and unfolds in men. The absurd mind cannot so much expect ethical rules at the end of its reasoning, as rather illustrations the breadth of human lives. The few following images are of this type. They prolong the absurd reasoning by giving it a specific attitude and their warmth. Do I need to develop the idea that an example is not necessarily an example to be followed, even less so if possible in the absurd world, and that these illustrations are not therefore models? Besides the fact that a certain vocation is required for this, one becomes ridiculous, with all due allowance, when drawing from Rousseau the conclusion that one must walk on all fours, and from Nietzsche that one must maltreat one's mother. It is essential to be absurd, writes a modern author. It is not essential to be a dupe. The attitudes of which I shall treat can assume their whole meaning only through consideration of their contraries. A sub-clerk in the post office is the equal of a conqueror if consciousness is common to them. All experiences are indifferent in this regard. There are some that do either a service or a disservice to man. They do him a service if he is conscious. Otherwise, that has no importance. A man's failures imply judgment, not of circumstances, but of himself. I am choosing solely men who aim only to expend themselves, or whom I see to be expending themselves. That has no further implications. For the moment I want to speak only of a world in which thoughts, like lives, are devoid of future. Everything that makes man work and get excited utilizes hope. The sole thought that is not mendacious is therefore a sterile thought. In the absurd world, the value of a notion or of a life is measured by its sterility. Don Juanism. If it were sufficient to love, things would be too easy. The more one loves, the stronger the absurd grows. It is not through lack of love that Don Juan goes from woman to woman. It is ridiculous to represent him as a mystic in quest of total love. But it is indeed because he loves them with the same passion and each time with his whole self that he must repeat his gift and his profound quest. Whence each woman hopes to give him what no one has ever given him. Each time they are utterly wrong, and merely manage to make him feel the need of that repetition. "At last," exclaims one of them, "I have given you love." Can we be surprised that Don Juan laughs at this? At last? No, he says, but once more. Why should it be essential to love rarely in order to love much? Is Don Juan melancholy? This is not likely. I shall barely have recourse to the legend. That laugh, the conquering insolence, that playfulness and love of the theatre are all clear and joyous. Every healthy creature tends to multiply himself. So it is with Don Juan. But furthermore, melancholy people have two reasons for being so. They don't know, or they hope. Don Juan knows and does not hope. He reminds one of those artists who know their limits never go beyond them, and in that precarious interval in which they take their spiritual stand, enjoy all the wonderful ease of masters. And that is indeed genius, the intelligence that knows its frontiers. Up to the frontier of physical death, Don Juan is ignorant of melancholy. The moment he knows, his laugh bursts forth and makes one forgive everything. He was melancholy at the time when he hoped. Today, on the mouth of that woman, he recognizes the bitter and comforting taste of the only knowledge. Bitter? Barely. That necessary imperfection that makes happiness perceptible. It is quite false to try to see Don Juan a man brought up on Ecclesiastes, for nothing is vanity to him except the hope of another life. He proves this because he gambles at other life against heaven itself, longing for desire killed by satisfaction. That commonplace of the impotent man does not belong to him. That is all right for Faust, who believed in God enough to sell himself to the devil. For Don Juan, the thing is simpler. Molina's Burlador ever replies to the threats of hell, "What a long respite you give me." What comes after death is futile, and what a long succession of days for whoever knows how to be alive. Faust craved worldly goods. The poor man had only to stretch out his hand. It already amounted to selling his soul when he was unable to gladden it. As for satiety, Don Juan insists upon it, on the contrary. If he leaves a woman, it is not absolutely because he has ceased to desire her. A beautiful woman is always desirable, but he desires another, and no, this is not the same thing. This world gratifies his every wish, and nothing is worse than losing it. This mad man is a great wise man, but men who live on hope do not thrive in this universe, where kindness yields to generosity, affection to virile silence, and communion to solitary courage. And all hasten to say he was a weakling, an idealist, or a saint. One has to disparage the greatness that insults. People are sufficiently annoyed, or smile that smile of complicity that debases what it admires, by Don Juan's speeches, and by that same remark that he uses on all women. But to anyone who seeks quantity in his joys, the only thing that matters is efficacy. What is the use of complicating the passwords that have stood the test? No one, neither the woman nor the man, listens to them, but rather to the voice that pronounces them. They are the rule, the convention, and the courtesy. After they are spoken, the most important still remains to be done. Don Juan is already getting ready for it. Why should he give himself a problem in morality? He is not like Meloz's Manara, who damns himself through a desire to be a saint. Hell for him is a thing to be provoked. He has but one reply to divine wrath, and that is human honor. "I have honor," he says to the commander, "and I am keeping my promise because I am a knight." But it would be just as great an error to make an immoralist of him. In this regard, he is like everyone else. He has the moral code of his likes and dislikes. Don Juan can be properly understood only by constant reference to what he commonly symbolizes. The ordinary seducer and the sexual athlete. He is an ordinary seducer, except for the difference that he is conscious, and that is why he is absurd. A seducer who has become lucid will not change for all that. Seducing is his condition in life. Only in novels does one change condition or become better. Yet it can be said that at the same time nothing is changed and everything is transformed. What Don Juan realizes in action is an ethic of quantity, whereas the saint, on the contrary, tends towards quality. Not to believe in the profound meaning of things belongs to the absurd man. As for those cordial or wonder-struck faces, he eyes them, stores them up, and does not pause over them. Time keeps up with them. The absurd man is he who is not apart from time. Don Juan does not think of collecting women. He exhausts their number, and with them his chances of life. Collecting amounts to being capable of living off one's past, but he rejects regret, that other form of hope. He is incapable of looking at portraits. Is he selfish for all that? In his way, probably. But here too, it is essential to understand one another. There are those who are made for living and those who are made for loving. At least Don Juan would be inclined to say so, but he would do so in a very few words, such as he is capable of choosing. For the love we are speaking of here is clothed in illusions of the eternal. As all the specialists in passion teach us, there is no eternal love but what is thwarted. There is scarcely any passion without struggle. Such a love culminates only in the ultimate contradiction of death. One must be Werther or nothing. Then, too, there are several ways of committing suicide, one of which is the total gift and forgetfulness of self. Don Juan, as well as anyone else, knows that this can be stirring, but he is one of the very few who know this is not the important thing. He knows just as well that those who turn away from all personal life through a great love enrich themselves, perhaps, but certainly impoverish those their love has chosen. A mother or passionate wife necessarily has a closed heart, for it is turned away from the world. A single emotion, a single creature, a single face, but all is devoured. Quite a different love disturbs Don Juan, and this one is liberating. It brings with it all the faces in the world, and its tremor comes from the fact that it knows itself to be mortal. Don Juan has chosen to be nothing. For him, it is a matter of seeing clearly. We call love what binds us to certain creatures only by reference to a collective way of seeing, for which books and legends are responsible. But of love I know only that mixture of desire, affection, and intelligence that binds me to this or that creature. That compound is not the same for another person. I do not have the right to cover all these experiences with the same name. This exempts one from conducting them with the same gestures. The absurd man multiplies here again what he cannot unify. Thus he discovers a new way of being which liberates him, at least as much as it liberates those who approach him. There is no noble love but that which recognizes itself to be both short-lived and exceptional. All those deaths and all those rebirths, gathered together as in a sheaf, make up for Don Juan the flowering of his life. It is his way of giving and of vivifying. I let it be decided whether or not one can speak of selfishness. I think at this point of all those who absolutely insist that Don Juan be punished, not only in another life, but even in this one. I think of all those tales, legends, and laughs about the aged Don Juan. But Don Juan is already ready. To a conscious man, old age and what it portends are not a surprise. Indeed, he is conscious only insofar as he does not conceal its horror from himself. There was, in Athens, a temple dedicated to old age. Children were taken there. As for Don Juan, the more people laugh at him, the more his figure stands out. Thereby he rejects the one the romantics lent him. No one wants to laugh at that tormented, pitiful Don Juan. He is pitied. Heaven itself will redeem him. But that's not it. In the universe of which Don Juan has a glimpse, ridicule, too, is included. He would consider it normal to be chastised. That is the rule of the game. And, indeed, it is typical of his nobility to have accepted all the rules of the game. Yet he knows he is right, and that there can be no question of punishment. A fate is not a punishment. That is his crime. And how easy it is to understand why the men of God call down punishment on his head. He achieves a knowledge without illusions, which negates everything they profess. Loving and possessing, conquering and consuming, that is his way of knowing. There is significance in that favorite scriptural word that calls the carnal act knowing. He is their worst enemy to the extent that he is ignorant of them. A chronicler relates that the true Burlador died assassinated by Franciscans who wanted to put an end to the excesses and blasphemies of Don Juan, whose birth assured him impunity. Then they proclaimed that heaven had struck him down. No one has proved that strange end, nor has anyone proved the contrary. But without wondering if it is probable, I can say that it is logical. I want merely to single out at this point the word birth, and to play on words. It was the fact of living that assured his innocence. It was from death alone that he derived a guilt now become legendary. What else does that stone commander signify? That cold statue set in motion to punish the blood and courage that dared to think? All the powers of eternal reason, of order, of universal morality, all the foreign grandeur of a god open to wrath, are summed up in him. That gigantic and soulless stone merely symbolizes the forces that Don Juan negated forever. But the commander's mission stops there. The thunder and lightning can return to the imitation heaven whence they were called forth. The real tragedy takes place quite apart from them. No, it was not under a stone hand that Don Juan met his death. I am inclined to believe in the legendary bravado, in that mad laughter of the healthy man provoking a non-existent god. But, above all, I believe that on that evening when Don Juan was waiting at Anna's, the commander didn't come, and that after midnight the blasphemer must have felt the dreadful bitterness of those who have been right. I accept even more readily the account of his life that has him eventually burying himself in a monastery. Not that the edifying aspect of the story can be considered probable. What refuge can he go to ask of God? But this symbolizes rather the logical outcome of a life completely imbued with the absurd, the grim ending of an existence turned towards short-lived joys. At this point, sensual pleasure winds up in asceticism. It is essential to realize that they may be, as it were, the two aspects of the same destitution. What more ghastly image can be called up than that of a man betrayed by his body, who, simply because he did not die in time, lives out the comedy while awaiting the end, face to face with that God he does not adore, serving him as he served life, kneeling before a void and arms outstretched towards a heaven without eloquence that he knows to be also without depth. I see Don Juan in a cell of one of those Spanish monasteries lost on a hilltop. As if he contemplates anything at all, it is not the ghosts of past loves, but perhaps through a narrow slit in the sun-baked wall, some silent Spanish plain, a noble soulless land in which he recognizes himself. Yes, it is on this melancholy and radiant image that the curtain must be rung down. The ultimate end, awaited but never desired, the ultimate end is negligible. Drama. The play's the thing, says Hamlet, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Catch is indeed the word, for conscience moves swiftly and withdraws within itself. It has to be caught on the wing, at that barely perceptible moment when it glances fleetingly at itself. The everyday man does not enjoy tarrying. Everything on the contrary hurries him onward. But at the same time, nothing interests him more than himself, especially his potentialities. Whence his interest in the theatre, in the show, where so many fates are offered him, where he can accept the poetry without feeling the sorrow. There, at least, can be recognized the thoughtless man, and he continues to hasten towards some hope or other. The absurd man begins where that one leaves off, where, ceasing to admire the play, the mind wants to enter in. Entering into all these lives, experiencing them in their diversity, amounts to acting them out. I am not saying that actors in general obey that impulse, that they are absurd men, but that their fate is an absurd fate which might charm and attract a lucid heart. It is necessary to establish this in order to grasp without misunderstanding what will follow. The actor's realm is that of the fleeting. Of all kinds of fame, it is known his is the most ephemeral. At least this is said in conversation, but all kinds of fame are ephemeral. From the point of view of Sirius, Goethe's work in 10,000 years will be dust and his name forgotten. Perhaps a handful of archaeologists will look for evidence as to our era. That idea has always contained a lesson. Seriously meditated upon, it reduces our perturbations to the profound nobility that is found in indifference. Above all, it directs our concerns towards what is most certain, that is, towards the immediate. Of all kinds of fame, the least deceptive is the one that is lived. Hence, the actor has chosen multiple fame, the fame that is hallowed and tested. From the fact that everything is to die some day, he draws the best conclusion. An actor succeeds and does not succeed. A writer has some hope even if he is not appreciated. He assumes that his work will bear witness to what he was. At best, the actor will leave us a photograph, and nothing of what he was himself. His gestures and his silences, his gasping or his panting with love will come down to us. For him, not to be known is not to act, and not acting is dying 100 times with all the creatures he would have brought to life or resuscitated. Why should we be surprised to find a fleeting fame built upon the most ephemeral of creations? The actor has 3 hours to be Iago or Alceste, Phaedra or Gloucester. In that short space of time, he makes them come to life and die on 50 square yards of boards. Never has the absurd been so well illustrated or at such length. What more revelatory epitome can be imagined than those marvelous lives, those exceptional and total destinies unfolding for a few hours within a stage set? Off the stage, Sigismondo ceases to count. 2 hours later he is seen dining out. Then it is perhaps that life is a dream. But after Sigismondo comes another. The hero suffering from uncertainty takes the place of the man roaring for his revenge. By thus sweeping over centuries and minds, by miming man, he can be, and as he is, the actor has much in common with that other absurd individual, the traveller. Like him, he drains something and is constantly on the move. He is a traveller in time, and for the best, the hunted traveller, pursued by souls. If ever the ethics of quantity could find sustenance, it is indeed on that strange stage. To what degree the actor benefits from the characters is hard to say, but that is not the important thing. It is merely a matter of knowing how far he identifies himself with those irreplaceable lives. It often happens that he carries them with him, that they somewhat overflow the time and place in which they were born. They accompany the actor who cannot very readily separate himself from what he has been. Occasionally, when reaching for his glass, he resumes Hamlet's gesture of raising his cup. No, the distance separating him from the creatures into whom he infuses life is not so great. He abundantly illustrates every month or every day that so suggestive truth that there is no frontier between what a man wants to be and what he is. Always concerned with better representing, he demonstrates to what a degree appearing creates being. For that is his art, to simulate absolutely, to project himself as deeply as possible into lives that are not his own. At the end of his effort, his vocation becomes clear, to apply himself wholeheartedly to being nothing or to being several. The narrower the limits allotted him for creating his character, the more necessary his talent. He will die in 3 hours under the mask he has assumed today. Within 3 hours he must experience and express a whole exceptional life. That is called losing oneself to find oneself. In those 3 hours he travels the whole course of the dead-end path that the man in the audience takes a lifetime to cover. A mime of the ephemeral. The actor trains and perfects himself only in appearances. The theatrical convention is that the heart expresses itself and communicates itself only through gestures and in the body, or through the voice, which is as much of the soul as of the body. The rule of that art insists that everything be magnified and translated into flesh. If it were essential on the stage to love as people really love, to employ that irreplaceable voice of the heart, to look as people contemplate in life, our speech would be in code. But here, silences must make themselves heard. Love speaks up louder, and immobility itself becomes spectacular. The body is king. Not everyone can be theatrical, and this unjustly maligned word covers a whole aesthetic and a whole ethic. Half a man's life is spent in implying, in turning away, and in keeping silent. Here the actor is the intruder. He breaks the spell chaining that soul, and at last the passions can rush on to their stage. They speak in every gesture, they live only through shouts and cries. Thus the actor creates his characters for display, He outlines or sculptures them and slips into their imaginary form, transfusing his blood into their phantoms. I am of course speaking of great drama, the kind that gives the actor an opportunity to fulfill his holy physical fate. Take Shakespeare, for instance. In that impulsive drama, the physical passions lead the dance. They explain everything. Without them, all would collapse. Never would King Lear keep the appointment set by madness without the brutal gesture that exiles Cordelia and condemns Edgar. It is just that the unfolding of that tragedy should thenceforth be dominated by madness. Souls are given over to the demons and their saraband. No fewer than 4 madmen, one by trade, another by intention, and the last 2 through suffering. 4 disordered bodies, 4 unutterable aspects of a single condition. The very scale of the human body is inadequate. The mask and the buskin, the makeup that reduces and accentuates the face in its essential elements, the costume that exaggerates and simplifies. That universe sacrifices everything to appearance and is made solely for the eye. Through an absurd miracle, it is the body that also brings knowledge. I should never really understand Iago unless I played his part. It is not enough to hear him, for I grasp him only at the moment when I see him. Of the absurd character, the actor consequently has the monotony. That single oppressive silhouette, simultaneously strange and familiar, that he carries about from hero to hero. There, too, the great dramatic work contributes to this entity of tone. This is where the actor contradicts himself. The same and yet so various, so many souls summed up in a single body. Yet it is the absurd contradiction itself, that individual who wants to achieve everything and live everything, that useless attempt, that ineffectual persistence. What always contradicts itself, nevertheless, joins in him. He is at that point where the body and mind converge, where the mind, tired of its defeats, turns towards its most faithful ally. And blessed are those, says Hamlet, whose blood and judgment are so well commingled that they are not a pipe for fortune's finger to sound what stop she please. How could the Church have failed to condemn such a practice on the part of the actor? She repudiated in that art the heretical multiplication of souls, the emotional debauch, the scandalous presumption of a mind that objects to living but one life, and hurls itself into all forms of excess. She proscribed in them that preference for the present, and that triumph of Proteus, which are the negation of everything she teaches. Eternity is not a game. A mind foolish enough to prefer a comedy to eternity has lost its salvation. Between everywhere and forever there is no compromise. Whence that much maligned profession can give rise to a tremendous spiritual conflict. What matters, said Nietzsche, is not eternal life, but eternal vivacity. All drama is, in fact, in this choice. Adrienne Lecouvreur, on her deathbed, was willing to confess and receive communion, but refused to abjure her profession. She thereby lost the benefit of the confession. Did this not amount in effect to choosing her absorbing passion in preference to God? And that woman in the death throes, refusing in tears to repudiate what she called her art, gave evidence of a greatness that she never achieved behind the footlights. This was her finest role and the hardest one to play. Choosing between heaven and a ridiculous fidelity, preferring oneself to eternity or losing oneself in God, is the age-old tragedy in which each must play his part. The actors of the era knew they were excommunicated. Entering the profession amounted to choosing hell, and the Church discerned in them her worst enemies. A few men of letters protest. What? Refuse the last rites to Molière? But that was just, and especially in one who died on stage and finished under the actor's makeup a life entirely devoted to dispersion. In his case, genius is invoked, which excuses everything, but genius excuses nothing, just because it refuses to do so. The actor knew at that time what punishment was in store for him, but what significance could such vague threats have compared to the final punishment that life itself was reserving for him? This was the one that he felt in advance and accepted wholly. To the actor, as to the absurd man, a premature death is irreparable. Nothing can make up for the sum of faces and centuries he would otherwise have traversed. But in any case, one has to die, for the actor is doubtless everywhere. But time sweeps him along too, and makes its impression with him. It requires but a little imagination to feel what an actor's fate means. It is in time that he makes up and enumerates his characters. It is in time likewise that he learns to dominate them. The greater number of different lives he has lived, the more aloof he can be from them. The time comes when he must die to the stage and for the world. What he has lived faces him. He sees clearly. He feels the harrowing and irreplaceable quality of that adventure. He knows and can now die. There are homes for aged actors. Conquest. No, says the conqueror. Don't assume that because I love action, I have had to forget how to think. On the contrary, I can thoroughly define what I believe. For I believe it firmly and I see it surely and clearly. Beware of those who say, I know this too well to be able to express it. For if they cannot do so, this is because they don't know it, or because out of laziness they stopped at the outer crust. I have not many opinions. At the end of a life, man notices that he has spent years becoming sure of a single truth. But a single truth, if it is obvious, is enough to guide an existence. As for me, I decidedly have something to say about the individual. One must speak of him bluntly, and, if need be, with the appropriate contempt. A man is more a man through the things he keeps to himself than through those he says. There are many that I shall keep to myself, but I firmly believe that all those who have judged the individual have done so with much less experience than we on which to base their judgment. The intelligence, the stirring intelligence perhaps, foresaw what it was essential to note. But the era, its ruins and its blood, overwhelms us with facts. It was possible for ancient nations, and even for more recent ones, down to our machine age, to weigh one against the other the virtues of society and of the individual, to try to find out which was to serve the other. To begin with, that was possible by virtue of that stubborn aberration in man's heart according to which human beings were created to serve or to be served. In the second place, it was possible because neither society nor the individual had yet revealed all their ability. I have seen bright minds express astonishment at the masterpieces of Dutch painters born at the height of the bloody wars in Flanders, Be amazed by the prayers of Silesian mystics brought up during the frightful 30 Years' War. Eternal values survive secular turmoils before their astonished eyes. But there has been progress since. The painters of today are deprived of such serenity, even if they have basically the heart the Creator needs. I mean the closed heart. It is of no use. For everyone, including the saint himself, is mobilized. This is perhaps what I felt most deeply at every form that miscarries in the trenches, at every outline, metaphor, or prayer crushed under steel. The eternal loses a round. Conscious that I cannot stand aloof from my time, I have decided to be an integral part of this. This is why I esteem the individual, only because he strikes me as ridiculous and humiliated. Knowing that there are no victorious causes, I have a liking for lost causes. They require an uncontaminated soul, equal to its defeat as to its temporary victories. For anyone who feels bound up with this world's fate, the clash of civilizations has something agonizing about it. I have made that anguish mine at the same time that I wanted to join in. Between history and the eternal, I have chosen history because I like certainties. Of it at least I am certain, and how can I deny this force crushing me? There always comes a time when one must choose between contemplation and action. This is called becoming a man. Such wrenches are dreadful. But for a proud heart, there can be no compromise. There is God or time, that cross or this sword. This world has a higher meaning that transcends its worries, or nothing is true but those worries. One must live with time and die with it, or else elude it for a greater life. I know that one can compromise and live in the world while believing in the eternal. That is called accepting. But I loathe this term and want all or nothing. If I choose action, don't think that contemplation is like an unknown country to me, but it cannot give me everything, and deprived of the eternal, I want to ally myself with time. I do not want to put down to my account either nostalgia or bitterness, and I merely want to see clearly. I tell you, tomorrow you will be mobilized. For you and for me, that is liberation. The individual can do nothing, and yet he can do everything. In that wonderful, unattached state, you understand why I exalt and crush him at one and the same time. It is the world that pulverizes him, and I who liberate him. I provide him with all his rights. Conquerors know that action is in itself useless. There is but one useful action, that of remaking man and of earth. I shall never remake men, but one must do as if. For the path of struggle leads me to the flesh. Even humiliated, the flesh is my only certainty. I can live only on it. The creature is my native land. This is why I have chosen this absurd and ineffectual effort. This is why I am on the side of the struggle. The epoch lends itself to this, as I have said. Hitherto, the greatness of a conqueror was geographical. It was measured by the extent of the conquered territories. There is a reason why the word has changed in meaning, and has ceased to signify the glorious general. The greatness has changed camp. It lies in protest and the blind alley sacrifice. There too it is not through a preference for defeat. Victory would be desirable, but there is but one victory, and it is eternal. That is the one I shall never have. That is where I stumble and cling. A revolution is always accomplished against the gods, beginning with the revolution of Prometheus, the first of modern conquerors. It is man's demands against his fate. The demands of the poor are but a pretext. But I can seize that spirit only in its historical act, and that is where I make contact with it. Don't assume, however, that I take pleasure in it. Opposite the essential contradiction, I maintain my human contradiction. I establish my lucidity in the midst of what negates it. I exalt man before what crushes him and my freedom. My revolt and my passion come together then in that tension, that lucidity, and that vast repetition. Yes, man is his own end, and he is his only end. If he aims to be something, it is in this life. Now, I know it only too well. Conquerors sometimes talk of vanquishing and overcoming, but it is always overcoming oneself that they mean. You are well aware of what that means. Every man has felt himself to be the equal of a god at certain moments. At least, this is the way it is expressed. But this comes from the fact that, in a flash, he felt the amazing grandeur of the human mind. The conquerors are merely those among men who are conscious enough of their strength to be sure of living constantly on those heights, and fully aware of that grandeur. It is a question of arithmetic, of more or less. The conquerors are capable of the more, but they are capable of no more than man himself when he wants. This is why they never leave the human crucible, plunging into the seething soul of revolutions. There they find the creature mutilated, but they also encounter there the only values they like and admire, man and his silence. This is both their destitution and their wealth. There is but one luxury for them, that of human relations. How can one fail to realize that in this vulnerable universe, everything that is human and solely human assumes a more vivid meaning? Taut faces, threatened fraternity, such strong and chaste friendship among men, these are the true riches because they are transitory. In their midst the mind is most aware of its powers and limitations. That is to say, its efficacy. Some have spoken of genius, but genius is easy to say. I prefer the intelligence. It must be said that it can be magnificent then. It lights up this desert and dominates it. It knows its obligations and illustrates them. It will die at the same time as this body, but knowing this constitutes its freedom. We are not ignorant of the fact that all churches are against us. A heart so keyed up eludes the eternal, and all churches, divine and political, lay claim to the eternal. Happiness and courage, retribution or justice are secondary ends for them. It is a doctrine they bring, and one must subscribe to it. But I have no concern with ideas or with the eternal. The truths that come within my scope can be touched with the hand. I cannot separate from them. This is why you cannot base anything on me. Nothing of the conqueror lasts, not even his doctrines. At the end of all that, despite everything, is death. We know also that it ends everything. This is why those cemeteries all over Europe which obsess some among us are hideous. People beautify only what they love, and death repels us and tires our patience. It too is to be conquered. The last Carrara, a prisoner in Padua, emptied by the plague and besieged by the Venetians, ran screaming through the halls of his deserted palace. He was calling on the devil and asking him for death. This was a way of overcoming it, and it is likewise a mark of courage characteristic of the Occident to have made so ugly the places where death thinks itself honored. In the rebel's universe, death exalts injustice. It is the supreme abuse. Others, without compromising either, have chosen the eternal and denounced the illusion of this world. Their cemeteries smile amid numerous flowers and birds. That suits the conqueror and gives him a clear image of what he has rejected. He has chosen, on the contrary, the black iron fence or the potter's field. The best among the men of God occasionally are seized with fright mingled with consideration and pity for minds that have lived with such an image of their death. Yet those minds derive their strength and justification from this. Our fate stands before us, and we provoke him, less out of pride than out of awareness of our ineffectual condition. We too sometimes feel pity for ourselves. It is the only compassion that seems acceptable to us, a feeling that perhaps you hardly understand, and that seems to you scarcely virile. Yet the most daring among us are the ones who feel it. But we call the lucid ones virile, and we do not want a strength that is apart from lucidity. Let me repeat that these images do not propose moral codes and involve no judgments. They are sketches. They merely represent a style of life. The lover, the actor, or the adventurer plays the absurd. But equally well, if he wishes, the chaste man, the civil servant, or the president of the republic. It is enough to know and to mask nothing. In Italian museums are sometimes found little painted screens that the priest used to hold in front of the face of condemned men to hide the scaffold from them. The leap in all its forms, rushing into the divine or the eternal, surrendering to the illusions of the everyday or of the idea, all these screens hide the absurd. But there are civil servants without screens, and they are the ones of whom I mean to speak. I have chosen the most extreme ones. At this level, the absurd gives them a royal power. It is true that those princes are without a kingdom, but they have this advantage over others. They know that all royalties are illusory. They know that is their whole nobility, and it is useless to speak in relation to them of hiding misfortune or of ashes of disillusion. Being deprived of hope is not despairing. The flames of earth are surely worth celestial perfumes. Neither I nor anyone can judge them here. They are not striving to be better, they are attempting to be consistent. If the term wise man can be applied to the man who lives on what he has without speculating on what he has not, then they are wise men. One of them a conqueror but in the realm of mind, a Don Juan but of knowledge, an actor but of the intelligence, knows this better than anyone. You, no wise, deserve a privilege on earth, and in heaven for having brought to perfection your dear little meek sheep, you nonetheless continue to be at best a ridiculous dear little sheep with horns and nothing more, even supposing that you do not burst with vanity and do not create a scandal by posing as a judge. In any case, it was essential to restore to the absurd reasoning more cordial examples. The imagination can add many others, inseparable from time and exile, who likewise know how to live in harmony with a universe without future and without weakness. This absurd, godless world is then peopled with men who think clearly and who have ceased to hope. And I have not yet spoken of the most absurd character, who is the Creator.